For more than a decade, I've been working with communities across Indiana to stop the proliferation of factory farms. And I cannot tell you how many times I've heard people say that factory farms are inevitable and necessary to feed the world's growing population that's expected to reach 10 billion by 2050. Well, today we're going to dispel that myth, and it is a myth. It's one that's perpetuated by huge multinational corporations that dominate global food production to protect their bottom lines. And the truth is that the only way we're going to be able to feed the world sustainably and without destroying our planet and ourselves is to do away with factory farms. In fact, the world already produces enough food to feed 10 billion people. The real problem is that much of that food goes to feed factory farmed livestock instead of people. A staggering amount of land, water, and energy resources go to growing the vast monocrops of corn and soybeans that go to feed factory farmed animals, not to grow food for our direct human consumption. As a result of this hugely inefficient system that we have now, that is of feeding billions of farm animals to, quote, feed the world, not only doesn't feed the world very well at all, it's a leading cause of the most serious environmental problems we face at every scale, from local to global, including climate change. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm first going to cover how we got this broken industrialized food system that we have, one that's controlled by literally a handful of large corporations. You know, our food system wasn't always this way, and understanding how to fix it requires that we understand what broke it in the first place. So we're also going to talk about why the current system is a problem for all of us, not just farming in rural communities. People who live in cities and urban areas also suffer from the ill effects of our broken food system. And making this connection for people on issues that they care about is how we're going to be able to grow the movement for change. We're also going to discuss how existing laws and policies have failed to address this serious problem and what we can do about it, both in terms of policy advocacy and as consumers. So as I go along, please pose questions in the chat box. I'm going to try to pay attention to that. You could also try raising your hand, given that there aren't that many of us. I think there's about 20 folks that are on the meeting right now. I'd like to try to have a dialogue as we go along. That may not be possible, though, with Zoom. So if you have a burning question, something that I've said you don't understand, go ahead and type it in the chat box and we'll address it when we get to Q&A. Or if I see it timely, I'll try to answer it as we go along. And as Jenny said at the beginning, there's no need to take notes. Just about everything I'm going to cover today is discussed in detail in the citizen guide that we've provided a link to. And it's also available on HEC's website at hecweb.org. All right, so let's start with how we got here. You might think that corporate consolidation and industrialization of our food system was really just the inevitable result of the Industrial Revolution, where technologies improved and farm families decided to leave the country, realizing that they could make a better living in the city. That is true to some extent, but much of what happened is the result of carefully developed and successfully implemented policies to purposefully eliminate factory farms. And I want to dive into that a little bit because I think a lot of people don't really know this piece of the problem. Back in the 1950s, after the Great Depression, leaders of major U.S. corporations, some are listed here, Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Sears Roebuck, Standard Oil, Johnson & Johnson, and others, came together as part of the Committee on Economic Development, or the CED, which is a business policy think tank that was formed after the Great Depression. And these industry leaders proposed an adaptive program for agriculture. Now, this CED policy is referenced in numerous scholarly articles, books, and other writings as pivotal to the change in farm policy that gave rise to our current food system. The copy that I was able to obtain has someone's notes on it, and you can see that in the page that I'm showing you here. His initials or her initials are DB. The black writing is that person's. The yellow highlights, though, are mine. So the purpose of this adaptive program for agriculture was to address what these industry leaders saw as the, quote, American farm problem, a problem that in their view was undermining industry's economic growth and their financial interests. Namely, that problem was too many farmers working the land out in the country and not enough factory workers and laborers in other non-farming sectors. It's what they characterized as the, quote, inadequate flow of resources out of farming. You can see I highlighted that in the table of contents. So to fix this farm problem, these industry leaders proposed to reduce the farm labor force by a third over a 5-year, very short 5-year period, which involved moving off the farm about 2 million of the 5 million farmers at the time into the urban labor force. To do that, these industry leaders proposed dramatically lowering the government price supports for farmers that had been in place since the Great Depression. And that way, small farmers wouldn't be able to make a living and would get out of farming. And according to the CED, doing this would add 2 million people to the urban labor pool, which would tend to depress wages and lead to cheaper labor costs. It would lower the cost of raw materials for food and clothing companies, and it would increase the return on investment in agriculture. So in other words, the plan was aimed at benefiting industry's bottom line. In my view, one thing that was particularly insidious in this plan is these corporate leaders recognized that policy change wouldn't be enough to push generational farm families out of farming fast enough. That to do that would also require some cultural change. And on that front, they proposed investing in projects that break up village life because village life is a major source of opposition to change. During the congressional committee hearings on the CED's proposal, farmers and farming groups from across the country sounded the alarm. I've put up a couple of examples here. This one is from the Iowa Farmers Union, who wrote to Congress that many farmers in Iowa have expressed deep concern over the statements released by the CED. The thought of reducing farm units by 2 million and the elimination of farm legislation to control supply and support prices spells doom to the family farm type of agriculture as we know it here in Iowa. They go on to say the program outlined by the CED would have a devastating effect on business done in more than 900 cities and towns in Iowa. It's been reported that one hometown businessman will go out of business for each 14 farmers that leave the trade area. So they were strongly encouraging Congress to reject the CED proposal. Similarly, the Wisconsin Farmers Union wrote, and I highlighted just a couple of key passages, halfway down, CED recommendations would aggravate rather than solve our farm problem. A free market for agriculture would bring great market price instability, family farm failures, and the gradual replacement of our traditional family-type farming by concentrators of economic power. Going further down, the CED says nothing about the real heart of the farm problem, which is the lack of farm bargaining power in the face of highly organized industry. Keep in mind, this is back in the 60s. The CED plan would take what little bargaining power the farmer has away from him. We hope to see the CED plan exposed in your hearings as the dangerous and heartless scheme that it really is. So fast forward to today, federal farm policy soon followed the CED's recommendations with instructions to farmers to get big or get out, which they did in droves. Since the 1950s, the U.S. has lost more than 3 million farms. In addition, Government price supports have shifted from ensuring that farmers received a fair price for their products to ensuring cheap commodity prices for agribusiness. All of this has served the intended purpose of expanding corporate consolidation and control of food production. And now today, nearly 90% of all agricultural subsidies go to the largest farms. Also today, just a handful of large corporations control food production, especially in the meat industry. Tyson Foods, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef Packing Company control 83% of beef production in the United States. Tyson Foods, Cargill, JBS, and Smithfield control 66% of pork production. And these same companies control more than half of poultry production. Notably, under antitrust laws in the US, market consolidation above 45% is considered highly concentrated and likely abusive. I see we've got a couple of questions. Oh, not for me. Okay. So through vertical integration, these corporations now control all stages of meat production, from genetics, birthing, feeding, transport, slaughter, processing, marketing to grocery store packaging. And this has not only squeezed out the small farmer who can't compete, but has truly decimated rural farming communities by eliminating the local infrastructure and businesses that once served the local farmers. Oh. There we go. So today, instead of family farmers raising livestock for local consumers, there's now roughly 25,000 industrial scale livestock operations in the country, also known as Kfos, or concentrated animal feeding operations, that produce the vast majority of the 9.8 billion farm animals that are raised and slaughtered each year in the United States. And in fact, according to the USDA agricultural census, approximately 70% of cows, 98% of pigs, 99% of turkeys, 98% of chickens raised for eggs, and 99% of chickens raised for meat are raised in factory farms like this one. Same is true in Indiana. We have a little over 1,700 confined feeding operations, or Kfos, where the vast majority of food animals are produced. We rank second nationally for egg production with 26.4 million laying hens. 90% of those, or 24 million, are confined in just 25 factory farms. We also lead the country in hog production, ranking 6th nationally with 11.3 million hogs sold annually. 91% of those, or 10.3 million hogs, come from just 516 hog factories. 10 of those are in Madison County, indicated by the dots there on your screen. Notably, that's not a very high amount as compared to some other counties in Indiana that have 100 or more factory farms. So aside from the inequity of displacing millions of farm families and decimating farming communities, why should any of us who live in urban areas care about the fact that most of our meat, dairy, and poultry products come from factory farms? Well, one of the reasons is that Kfos have made our water unsafe to drink, swim, and fish in. Based on government data, we know that the leading source of water contamination in Indiana continues to be E. coli, which indicates that animal waste is present. We also know from government data that confined feeding operations are by far the top source of this E. coli contamination. This makes sense because livestock generate a whole heck of a lot more waste than humans do. Livestock in the United States generate an estimated 335 million tons of waste every year, which is more than 40 times that produced by the human population. In Indiana, our livestock generate as much urine and feces as that produced by 87 million people, or 14 times the human population of Indiana. Drilling down to Madison County, the 10 Kfos that are present there based on the number and type of animals in those facilities. The animals generate more than 7 times the amount of urine and feces produced by the entire human population of the city of Anderson. And just because animal waste comes from livestock doesn't make it any less harmful. The pollution strength of raw manure is as much as 110 times greater than that of raw municipal sewage, and is therefore arguably more harmful than human waste, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. Even so, under our current regulations, this livestock waste is allowed to be stored in unlined earthen lagoons, like you see on the photo to the left. It's also legal to spray this waste untreated on land, whereas depicted in the photo on the right, human waste has to be treated at a wastewater treatment plant before it's ever released into the environment. So now, of the 9 watersheds tracked in IDEM, our state environmental agency's water assessment, an average of 98% of stream miles are deemed not suitable for recreation, i.e. to swim and fish in, because of E. coli from animal waste. In other words, our lakes and streams are seriously polluted because of factory farms. Some of those E. coli polluted streams are in Madison County, as depicted here. The red streams show the E. coli impaired waterways, and interestingly, they somewhat correlate to the location of factory farms. Another reason that all of us should be concerned about factory farms is because they pollute the air with noxious emissions, including hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, particulate matter, endotoxins, and chemical compounds that are well known to pose serious health risks for people who live nearby. In fact, a Purdue University study of air emissions at a dairy Kfo in Indiana found that ammonia emissions were released at a rate of between 18 and 75 grams per day per cow. So in other words, an average size dairy Kfo with 4,000 cows will emit as much as 660 pounds of ammonia into the air every day, which is far above the regulatory threshold for being regulated under the Clean Air Act, except Kfos are completely exempt from regulation under the Clean Air Act, as we'll talk about in a little bit. These gases are dispersed into the surrounding area where people live in 3 main ways. Hog facilities, as you see in the top photo, have deep waste pits underneath the buildings where the animals are on top and they defecate and waste is collected underneath. These animals, so they're inside these buildings with the waste. So they have to use these ventilation fans to suck the air emissions out of the buildings, because if they leave it inside, the animals will die. Another way that emissions get emitted into the ambient air is the large earthen lagoons that you see in the lower bottom right photo, which just perpetually off-gas emissions. And then it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's perfectly legal to spray untreated this waste on grounds. They spray it through irrigation, irrigate on farm fields through these irrigation boy, I'm not saying this right. Anyway, as you see in the picture in the bottom left. So that also releases air emissions into the surrounding community. Of course, common sense tells us that if brief exposure to a mere 60 gallons of urine and feces collected in a typical porta pot is uncomfortable, exposure to the stench of millions of gallons of urine and feces in a massive pit or lagoon can be unbearable. Another reason that we should all be concerned about factory farms is the rise of antibiotic-resistant disease due to the overuse of antibiotics in livestock at factory farms. According to the FDA, approximately 80% of antibiotics sold in the United States are fed to non-disease livestock at factory farms to promote their growth and ward off the stress and disease caused from living in unnatural, confined conditions. And as confirmed by the CDC, this prophylactic use of antibiotics in non-disease livestock has contributed to the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria in humans through contamination of our food. In fact, some infections now resist multiple antibiotics. For example, MRSA, which is a pathogen that now takes more lives each year than HIV/AIDS. And due to this serious public health threat and air emissions as well, the public health threats posed by both, the American Public Health Association recently announced a policy statement advising federal, state, and local governments to impose a national moratorium on all new and expanding Kfos until these public health concerns are addressed. Another reason we should all care about factory farms is that in addition to air and water pollution and antibiotic-resistant disease, the meat industry is also a leading cause of climate change. According to the most recent report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, meat and dairy production is the #1 source of all human-caused greenhouse gases. The meat industry is also the largest user of land. 30% of the land surface of the planet goes to raising livestock for food. It's also the leading cause of habitat destruction and species extinction. And here's why. About 70 billion farm animals are raised every year worldwide, more than 10 billion in the US alone, and more than 6 million are killed for food every hour. It takes a heck of a lot of land to grow the amount of grain needed to feed those 70 billion animals, roughly 16 pounds of grain to make just 1 pound of beef. In the US alone, livestock eat more than 50% of the grain we produce. And raising 70 billion animals requires a lot of water too. Animal agriculture is responsible for nearly 30% of all freshwater consumption in the world and nearly 50% of water used in the US. The slide here shows you the inefficiency, 2,400 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of meat versus just 25 gallons to produce a pound of wheat. This staggering inefficient use of our resources is particularly disturbing from a humanitarian perspective, given that we currently grow enough food to feed more than 10 billion people, but 50% of it is now going to feed livestock. And 82% of starving children live in countries where food is grown to feed livestock that are eaten by people in Western countries. In fact, 15 times more protein can be produced on a given area of land by growing plants for direct human consumption rather than feeding it to livestock. So moving on, if destroying the planet isn't enough reason to care about factory farms, there's also the systemic abuse of factory farmed animals. Just like our dogs and cats, the billions of animals raised and killed each year for meat are sentient, complex beings and capable of feeling pain, frustration, joy, and excitement. Yet they are viewed by the meat industry as commodities to be produced, and as a result suffer a myriad of assaults to their physical, mental, and emotional well-being. Unfortunately, there are no federal laws that protect farm animals from this cruelty, and the majority of states, including Indiana, exempt the industry's, quote, accepted agricultural practices, which include Kfos, no matter how abusive, from the scope of the law's animal cruelty statutes, or of the state's animal cruelty statutes. Put a different way, the treatment of factory farmed animals is inhumane and cruel, but it's perfectly legal. For instance, chickens are confined by tens of thousands in grower houses, like you see there, which are artificially lit, force ventilated, and completely barren, except for the long rows of feeders and drinkers. And due to selective breeding, these birds grow abnormally fast and large, which causes them to suffer gait defects, broken bones, and severe pain. Once they reach market weight, these birds are stuffed into crates for transport, where they often suffer dislocated and broken hips, legs, and wings, as well as internal hemorrhages. Also, during their journey to slaughter, these birds, like other factory farmed animals, are not given food or water and are afforded little, if any, protection from extreme temperatures. At the slaughter plant, the birds are uncrated, dumped onto conveyors, and hung upside down in shackles by their legs as they pass through an electrified water bath before their throats are cut, usually by a machine. And due to the rapid speed of slaughter lines, mistakes occur, leaving some birds still conscious as they enter tanks of scalding water intended to loosen their feathers. Chickens in the egg industry also suffer immensely, beginning right after hatching. Male baby chicks are considered useless byproducts because they're unable to lay eggs and are not bred for meat production. As such, millions of baby chicks each year are gassed and thrown into garbage bins where they are left to die from dehydration or asphyxiation. Female chicks are mutilated without any pain relief when the tips of their beaks are seared off with a hot blade to prevent them from pecking and engaging in other harmful behaviors that result from intensive confinement. For that matter, most egg-laying hens are confined in small wire battery cages like you see there that are stacked several tiers high and extend down long warehouses. And in these battery cages, hens are given less space than an area of a letter-size sheet of paper, 8 by 11, in which to eat, sleep, lay eggs, and defecate. And this makes it impossible for them to spread their wings or engage in natural behaviors such as dust bathing, foraging, or nesting. The more than 235 million pigs that we slaughter every year in the US don't fare much better. Sows are put through consecutive cycles of impregnation, giving birth and nursing, all while intensively confined. Although pigs are intelligent and highly social animals, pregnant sows are kept in gestation crates, like you see there, that are so small they're unable to even turn around. Right before giving birth, the sows are moved to restrictive farrowing crates that are designed to keep them from crushing their piglets. However, the crates are so small, the mama pig can only stand up and lie down. And then after the piglets are weaned, the cycle begins again for her, who churns out an average of 2.5 litters each year until she can no longer produce and is sent to slaughter. Cows in the dairy industry endure endless cycles of artificial insemination, mechanized milking, and giving birth. Many are routinely given hormones to increase milk production. The amount of work done by an average dairy cow during peak lactation is so immense that it's comparable to a human jogging for 6 hours every day, almost year-round. And although cows can naturally live for more than 20 years, the average dairy cow is spent and sent to slaughter before she reaches the age of 5. To continue producing milk, dairy cows must continuously give birth, but male calves are of no value to the dairy industry. Consequently, within the first few days of their life, male calves are taken from their mothers and raised for veal, where they are intensively confined and tethered in stalls so small they're unable to turn around for their entire 16 to 18-week lives before slaughter. These are just a few of the meat industry's incredibly cruel and inhumane practices that treat animals as commodities for profit instead of living, feeling creatures. I see you've got some chat questions here. I'm going to pause for a second. Well, many of these questions, such as what can we do about all this? Why not use the old way of rotating fields? A lot of good questions that I think I'm going to get to. So if you all don't mind, I'm going to keep plowing through, and hopefully my continued presentation is going to address some of what you've asked. And what we don't address, we are going to have a Q&A at the end. But I'm going to keep checking in on your questions. Okay, so we've talked about animal cruelty, climate change, air and water pollution. Putting that aside, the meat industry is also costing us our health in terms of obesity, cardiac disease, and other illnesses related to our excess meat consumption. Today, the average American eats a heck of a lot of meat, roughly 200 pounds per person every single year. And believe it or not, that's 6 times more than what the average American consumed in the 1930s. Oh, screen is frozen. Here we go. So why are we eating so much meat? Well, one reason is that today it's much cheaper to eat a bacon double cheeseburger than it is to eat a salad. The reason for that is because the meat industry is now heavily subsidized, whereas fruit and vegetable growers only get the tiniest sliver of taxpayer help. So now the true cost of eating meat is not reflected in the price the way it was back in our parents' and grandparents' time. From a nutrition standpoint, our food subsidies are completely out of whack. If you see up in the left-hand corner, it shows what the recommended daily allowance of fruits and vegetables, grains, and protein and dairy, and then compare that to what gets subsidized. The vast majority is dairy and protein, meat and dairy. And this is especially harmful in terms of health outcomes for low-income families who live in food deserts and can't afford to eat healthily. So we'll start now to one of the questions that I saw: what can we do about all this? And understanding that is to first understand the current state of our law and policy. And one might ask, don't they protect us? And unfortunately, there are serious gaps in federal and state environmental regulations and other regulations of factory farms. To start with, the EPA's authority to regulate Kfos in the United States was completely gutted back in 2011 by this federal court decision, National Pork Producers versus EPA. Under the Clean Water Act, a Kfo is considered a point source required to get a permit before they can discharge into waterways. But this court decision held that the Kfo owner gets to determine whether or not its facility discharges. And so the only way EPA's authority would be triggered is if there is a proven discharge. So there's no permit, there's no oversight, and you have to wait until harm is caused before EPA would have any authority to regulate. And of course, the problem with that is if there's no oversight, it's pretty hard to catch the discharge unless nearby citizens witness it and call it in. So the effect of that is that of the 25,000 Kfos in the US, less than 8,000 of them are subject to federal regulation under the Federal Clean Water Act. After that decision, all of the Kfo-size confined feeding operations, or the largest facilities that were subject to the Federal Clean Water Act, have chosen to leave the program. So now all of our Kfos and Cfos in Indiana are regulated under the state rule, which is implemented by the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. And that rule, what I call the Cfo rule, is pretty meager. There's no consideration of property values or whether the land use or siting decisions for a Kfo are appropriate. There's no limits on the air pollution that Kfos emit. In the permitting process, the corporate integrator, which is the big company actually calling the shots, is not required to be disclosed. Also under the rule, Kfos and their big pits and lagoons can be built in karst terrain and other sensitive areas. Karst terrain is where there's sinkholes and where surface and groundwater have an easy connection, so waste can easily get into the groundwater. Kfos can be located just 100 feet from on-site water wells and property lines, just 300 feet away from our surface waters and off-site water wells. And particularly problematic for people who live in rural communities, Kfos can be, regardless of how large, can be located just 400 feet from adjacent homes, churches, and schools. And that's not 400 feet from the property line, that's structure to structure. So if you have a home that's 300 feet from your property line, the Kfo can locate 100 feet from its property line and use your property essentially as an easement. There's also, as I mentioned, this 400 feet doesn't change whether it's a Kfo with 2,000 hogs versus a Kfo with 10,000 hogs, which of course would be much more harmful and disruptive to people who live nearby, but the setback is the same. Excuse me. As long as the proposed new or expanding facility meets these meager requirements, IDEM has no authority to deny a permit to protect surrounding neighbors. For that matter, IDEM hasn't denied a single permit for a Kfo in the 10 years since the Cfo rule was amended in 2012. Also, despite the significant data from numerous scientific and industry-funded studies conducted over decades that show Kfos generate noxious odors and produce dangerous air emissions that threaten our health, and especially for people who live nearby, Kfos remain unregulated under the Clean Air Act. Making matters worse, in 2018, Congress passed the Fair Agricultural Reporting Method Act, or the FARM Act, which exempts Kfos from having to even report their emissions under our Superfund law, which leaves rural communities completely in the dark as to what they're being exposed to. Making matters even worse, Indiana's Right to Farm Act bars all damages claims brought by neighbors that are harmed by Kfos, even if those neighbors were there long before the Kfo was built next to them. And this is really a sad result, because the intended purpose of the Right to Farm Act, when it was initially enacted back in the 70s, was to protect farmers from urban sprawl. In other words, people moving from the city out to the country and not liking the farm smell and suing the farmer and putting him out of business. So that was the initial intent. But what's happened is it's generational small farmers, people who have lived in their homes their entire lives, find that they are, their new neighbor is a 10,000 hog Kfo, and they literally can do nothing about it because the Right to Farm Act bars their damages claim. So what can we do? Well, first we've got to demand that our lawmakers undo the bad policies that got us here and enact new policies that will level the playing field for small independent farmers that use regenerative instead of degenerative agricultural practices, which of course don't include Kfos. So how do we do that? Well, one of those needed reforms is to end the massive taxpayer subsidies that go to the meat industry and instead reallocate that support to farmers that use regenerative practices to grow diverse crops of fruits, vegetables, grains, and livestock sustainably, including support to rebuild that local infrastructure that's so necessary so that these farmers can directly serve local consumers. To do that requires that we tell our representatives in Congress what we want to see in the next farm bill, which is when those subsidies get reallocated. Now, the current farm bill was enacted in December of 2018, so it expires in 2023. The biggest factor then in how the next farm bill turns out is who's going to control Congress in 2023. So let's just talk a little bit about the representatives that you all have in Madison County. Excuse me. Currently, most of Madison County is in the fifth district. And so your congressional leaders include Senator Todd Young, who did vote for the current 2018 Farm Bill. He's up for re-election in November 22, so keep that in mind when you go to the polls. Senator Mike Braun, who was elected in 2018, he didn't get to vote for the current Farm Bill, but one hopeful note is that he has introduced legislation to address climate change. So it seems that he is open potentially to addressing this issue as well. So it's really critical that we all weigh in with Senator Braun now to do the right thing on the Farm Bill, to weigh in and cast his vote for reallocating those subsidies away from big ag to sustainable ag. And then you also have House Representative Victoria Spartz. She was elected in 2020, so she didn't vote on the current Farm Bill, so we don't really know where she stands, but it's still important that you all weigh in with her about your views on how the Farm Bill money should be spent. The second policy reform that we all need to get behind is the Farm System Reform Act, which was introduced by Senator Cory Booker. The bill has several co-sponsors in the House and Senate, and it's supported by more than 300 sustainable farming groups, animal welfare groups, environmental and public health organizations, including HEC and the Indiana Farmers Union. What would the Farm System Reform Act do? Well, first, it would strengthen our antitrust law to crack down on the monopolistic practices of multinational meat packers and corporate integrators. So it would break up those monopolies to level the playing field for small farmers. It would place an immediate moratorium on new and expanding large Kfos, the biggest of big, and it would phase out the largest Kfos by 2040. It would also hold corporate integrators responsible for pollution and other harm caused by Kfos. As I mentioned earlier, the corporate integrator is not identified in permitting, so there's really no way to hold the company responsible, even though they're calling the shots on where to locate these facilities and really driving how many animals are raised in a particular location. And then the bill would also provide a voluntary buyout for farmers who want to get out of factory farming to transition out of operating a Kfo into regenerative and sustainable farming. While we work on national farm policy reform, we also must focus our attention on reforming state regulation of Kfos so that the meat industry internalizes the true cost of doing business. In Indiana, that state regulatory reform should give IDEM the authority to deny a permit to build or expand a Kfo to protect human health and the environment from the operation's air emissions. And as I mentioned, IDEM has no authority to deny a permit on that basis now, even if there's evidence that people are being severely harmed. State reform should impose greater setbacks, at least a mile from homes, schools, businesses, churches, parks, and other public places. And if such a setback isn't possible, then the developer of the Kfo ought to be required to fairly compensate impacted neighbors. We also need state air pollution limits for hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and particulate matter emissions from Kfos. There should be a public nuisance provision that would allow IDEM to revoke a Kfo permit if the operation becomes a public health or environmental threat or a nuisance to its neighbors. And of course, we need to demand a repeal of Indiana's Unjust Right to Farm Act. I did want to mention that HEC has written legislation that would do all of these things. And that legislation has been introduced in several sessions of the Indiana General Assembly, not this year, but in past years, with bipartisan bill sponsors, but the bill has just not moved anywhere. And the reason for that is it's going to take more than HEC pushing a bill. We literally need to have everybody who cares about this issue weighing in with their own state lawmakers and demanding this sort of legislative reform. So we hope that you'll get involved in that effort. And on that front, it looks like most of Madison County is represented or is in either districts 35 and 36. So your House representatives would be Representative Elizabeth Roray for District 35, and in District 36, Representative Terry Jo Austin. On the Senate side, it looks like Senator Tim Lannon is one of your senators, as well as Senator Mike Gaskell. An easy way to find their contact information, we'll give you our slides, so you could get it literally from my slides. But if you ever just want to look up who your legislator is for sure, go to the Indiana General Assembly website, iga.in.gov, and click on Find Your Legislator. If you type in your address, it'll tell you who your legislators are and their contact information. Also, everything you need to know to get actively involved in advocating for these federal and state legislative reforms is available on HEC's Bill Watch page, which spotlights important bills and calls to action, including links to how to find your legislator, summaries of what the bills would do, some talking points for what to say when you reach out to your legislator. And if you want real-time updates for where these bills are in the process, make sure to follow us on Facebook or Twitter, and sign up to receive our action alerts during the legislative session, which, by the way, is on now, if you didn't know. Ultimately, though, it's up to you to decide whether to support an industrial food system or a sustainable one, and you don't have to wait around for policy reform to do it. You can create consumer demand for sustainably produced food by voting with your food dollars. Instead of buying industrial produced meat and dairy at chain or box grocery stores, you can buy it from local and regional farmers who sell at farmers markets, CSAs, buying clubs, and food co-ops such as Purple Porch Co-op, Homestead Heritage, Seven Sons Meat Company, Tyner Pond Farms, and others that connect local Indiana farmers to consumers year-round. There's a searchable online database for CSAs and food co-ops at localharvest.org. And Madison County has a huge number of sustainable farms and markets. I've listed a few for you here. Shambhala Farms, which is one of our sponsors today, Asparagus Amy's, Dancing Bee Farms, Fields of Joy. Again, these slides I'll make available. They all have an online presence. There's the Anderson City Market, Collective Roots Market and Cafe, Farm Stand Second Story, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I looked, Madison County has more than 20 some odd markets, farmers markets that you can take advantage of. And regardless of where you buy your food, one of the most impactful things you can do is to eat less meat and dairy. According to the UN Climate Change Panel, we could feed the world sustainably if we all made vegetables and fruit the star of our diets, with dairy and animal-based products playing very minor roles. If you don't know where to start, give Meatless Mondays a try. Giving up meat just one day a week would decrease your meat consumption by nearly 15%, effectively decreasing the problems associated with meat production by the same amount. And ultimately, reducing the global demand for meat and dairy is really the only way that our food system can be sustainable, because at current rates of consumption, it'll take the resources of several Earths to feed the world in 2050, and we only have one. So with that, I see we have lots of good questions. Hopefully my screen is down. Okay. Let me start at the beginning. You guys feel free to raise your hand too as I answer these questions. Okay. Lots of comments. I've been aware of this issue for decades, and it still breaks my heart every time I see and think about it. Katie, I know, me too. And I do this for a living. Carol, you say, I get my eggs and meat from Tyner Pond Farms. Why don't we encourage and support more farms like this one? I agree. That is actually the point of today, is to get people to start making those consumer choices. Well, I see a lot of comments, but not a lot of questions. If folks could, actually, Jenny and Susie, if you want to jump on, we can start having a little bit of a dialogue too.
Hi, Kim. Yeah, sorry about that. I actually was just addressing the question about why we're focusing on Madison County, and just so everybody knows what that's about is we are going to be doing workshops and forums in all of the counties along the White River watershed. So we've done one in Delaware and did a statewide one, and this just happens to be Madison County. So in the future, we'll be doing all the other counties that are along the watershed, because we are focusing a lot on impaired rivers or impaired waters and you know, some of the major polluters in those waters. Scrolling through as well. Yes, and Sharon had mentioned Madison County Local Food Network. If you guys are not familiar with them yet and you're in Madison County, please check them out. They're doing some really great work. They're very active and doing a lot of the things. They have a little bit of a different focus than we do, but they're absolutely focused on local foods and food insecurity. So please check them out if you're not familiar with them.
Actually, Jenny, I do see a couple of comments that I think it would be good for me to address.
Okay.
Yeah, there is a comment between, well, it doesn't matter, between two people. One person says, exactly, I feel like this is turning into a PETA webinar. And I'm assuming that comment is getting at the information that I provided about how animals are treated in factory farms. It could be that this is not a topic that moves you or one that you particularly care about. But for some people who care deeply about animals, they aren't aware of how farm animals are treated in factory farms and that it is legally sanctioned. Typically, the talking point that we hear is that there's just a few bad actors. And of course, you get these horrific videos where animals are being, directly abused. And when we talk about systemic animal abuse, it's what is legal at the factory farms that are problematic. And we think that's important for people to know. We think that's important for people to know because it not only is just about animal cruelty, but when you raise animals in confinement in that way, as I talked about, it requires the use of, antibiotics to keep them from getting sick, from living in those sorts of unhealthy conditions. It results in this tremendous amount of waste being produced in one location that gets then spread on nearby fields. Concentrating animals in this way is the problem. And part of that problem is an animal welfare issue, which a lot of folks, we think, should be aware of. So I hope when you say you're disappointed because you thought this was turning into a PETA webinar, we just think that the animal welfare issue is also an important one. Please feel free to ask questions, guys. I'm here. We've got quite a bit of time left. And also, I guess, let me respond to a couple of other comments. We're not encouraging people to be vegetarian or vegan. Really, the message here is that we all have to eat less meat to reduce our consumption of meat because our current rates of consumption are unsustainable, and also to be mindful about where we're buying our meat and dairy products from, because that's equally as important. If it's right for you, if you feel like the decision to go vegetarian or vegan is right for you, obviously that's something that we would support, but that we're not advocating that everyone has to go vegetarian or vegan in order to end factory farming.
Kate has a good question, and I don't know if you just saw that come in. What's being done to help legislatively to help small farmers?
Yeah, I mean, not enough. That's kind of what at the end of my presentation, I was talking about, some of the federal and state reforms that we need to enact in order to level the playing field. And I think the most impactful one are at the federal level with respect to the Farm Bill and reallocating the tremendous subsidies that go right now to big ag and transitioning that to supporting small farmers, sustainable farmers, and the infrastructure. That's another thing that's kind of missing from the equation. At the beginning of my presentation, I kind of walked you all through how local farm communities were decimated as farms got bigger and bigger and concentrated into big companies, because these big companies have their own processing plants. And so the local butcher, the local grain operator, all of the local businesses that once supported local farmers went out of business, kind of having like the Walmart effect. And so we need to help we need to invest now in rural communities to rebuild that infrastructure that will support local farmers. All of that can be done as part of the Farm Bill. And then, of course, the Farm System Reform Act, which was the other federal bill I talked about, which would break up the monopolies, the big ag monopolies. That would also go a long way towards leveling the playing field for small farmers. Barb, I agree, eating meat is a personal preference. And not everyone is, no matter where you are on the spectrum here, this is just about giving folks information so that they can be informed eaters. Understanding what the consequence of your food choices are. So for some people, giving up meat is not an option, and we understand that, but hopefully after today, you'll know to buy your meat from local sustainable farmers.
Lois, do you have a question?
Yes, comment and question. It was pretty much overwhelming of the statistics that you presented, just unbelievable as far as the contamination of our waterways and air contamination from the way the big farms are run. I was just thinking here in Anderson, really right behind our house, we've had a big project going on along White River to replace the combined sewer storms, storm sewers. There we go. Combined
Yes.
The sewage and the stormwater run together, and then it's if it overflows, it goes into the river. If we have a big wet event. And how much money that is put into that. And yet, from your statistics, that's such a minor impact on the waterways compared to what's being poured in from these big farms. And you said we have 10 of those in Madison County, I think.
Yeah.
It's really hard then, where do you put your efforts? There are so many places, so many things we could focus on from this presentation. It's really difficult to know.
Yeah. We hated to see all the trees get cut down in the wetland and all of these things. And many, many dollars went in and are going in because it's not finished yet. Mm-hmm. So what do you do then you have 10 farms that are probably, I don't know, would you say they're putting more stuff in our rivers than all of everything that pours into this big system in the back? Well, Lois, I really appreciate your question. And I think what you're getting at is something that we all feel. There's so many pressing problems that we face. Which one should we care about? Which one shall we devote our energies to? And I can't really answer that question for you. But what I can, and then the other piece of your question that I also want to address is whether or not the 10 Kfos that are in Madison County are more of a problem than your combined sewer overflows. So I'm going to talk about both of those. With respect to the first one, the fact that there are so many problems, what I have found is helpful is to think about what most moves me. What is the one thing that I can do that I will stick to and devote my time to, and do that? Because if we all did one thing that really is meaningful to us, eventually we'd all be making an impact, right? With respect to food choice, that's kind of an easy one. I mean, that's a low-hanging fruit. You've got lots of great choices in Madison County to support local farmers there. To be mindful of where you're buying your food. That doesn't, that doesn't require you to contact lawmakers or get involved and understand a legislative process. I think that's a pretty easy one. Then you can, if you feel like, all right, I've done some there. If you really want to go further, the next real key thing is for lawmakers to hear from us. If you've got a good contact with a state lawmaker, with your state lawmaker, reach out to him or her. You would be surprised. The conversations that I've had with state legislators is that if they hear from just 5 of their constituents, they'll take an issue seriously. So often they don't hear from anyone. And so if they just hear from a few people on the same issue, that gets their attention. So it's super important that you weigh in and tell people, tell your lawmakers what it is that you want. With respect to the second question, and I don't know if that's helpful to you, I hope it is, but with respect to your second question, the likelihood that the 10 Kfos in Madison County are causing the E. coli impairment versus your combined sewer overflows is high based on the sheer amount of livestock waste being produced versus human waste. If you remember in the slide, I gave you the statistics about how many animals there are, and based on the type, they produce something like 7 times more waste than the human population of the city of Anderson. Yet under current regulation, that waste doesn't have to be treated. So the likelihood that those facilities are causing the vast majority of E. coli impairment is pretty high. And based on the IDEM data that I showed you, IDEM even confirms that confined feeding operations are the major source of that impairment. So can I say this facility is causing this pollution problem? No, I can't say that. But I can say that overall, Kfos are an unregulated, unaddressed source of animal waste in our waterways. Does that help?
Yes, it does. It made me think of an article in the Herald Bulletin that was talking about all this money that's coming into the state, and in this case, Madison County, for various things. And I'm thinking this, it just sounds like an opportunity to address some issues around this topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention in my presentation is that your local zoning ordinances in Madison County are pretty good. And if you, as far as citing Kfos, so there, if a Kfo is irresponsibly cited, there is a process in your county zoning ordinance to appeal bad decisions. There is a larger setback from residential homes in Madison County. I think it's 1,325 feet is the setback. So there are some, still not enough, but it's better than what IDEM requires. And I think because Madison County is more of an urban area, you may have more sympathetic local government officials that would be sensitive to concerns about neighbor concerns with respect to confined feeding operations. So one way to make sure that you don't get any more factory farms in Madison County is to weigh in with your local government officials, if there is any permits that come around for a new Kfo, to get involved in that and appeal and fight it from a local zoning perspective. And I've helped communities do that. So, keeping that in the back of your mind, local regulation is a good tool to use as well.
May I make one more comment?
Absolutely.
Okay. The idea of stopping them is one thing, but surely somewhere in this big world we have come up with a way to better handle that waste. And that maybe if we could find that. Now this doesn't hit the target as far as mistreatment of animals, but it would take care of one of the issues perhaps, and that would be, and again, with money available right now, there might be some things that could be done that would at least take care of part of the issue, and that is the runoff.
Well, unfortunately, until we require these large factory farms to internalize the true cost to better, to handle their pollution, if we don't require that, they don't do it voluntarily. And there are technologies out there. Clearly, we clean our human waste. We treat that. Livestock waste is no different than human waste. We're both animals. It's essentially the same biological output. So we know what to do with this waste. The problem is that we've decided not to regulate this particular waste stream. So once that, and which is why part of my presentation was kind of devoted to advocating for state policy reform, which would give our state environmental regulatory agency the authority it needs to require these facilities to use that type of waste treatment technology. They won't do it voluntarily. I mean, they've been around for quite a while, and we all know the problem, and the technologies are out there, and they're not using them. So it's literally, it's got to be a policy change. Those are great questions. Thank you very much. I hope
do you have a resource on the webpage as far as what those new technologies are? I'd like to, or should I just Google that? Maybe that's a thing to do.
There are, I'm sorry, my phone is ringing in the background, part of the hazards of presenting from home. There we go. We do have some limited resources, Lois, on our website. Not enough, but I can, if you want to connect with me after the presentation today, I have access to that information. I'd be happy to share it with you. Jenny, do we have other questions in the chat box? I've kind of lost track.
Yeah, sure. We do actually. Well, one thing that I think that is really, well, first of all, let me get back to it. The Young Farmers Coalition, Hoosier Young Farmers Coalition. Are you aware of it? This is a question from Kate. Are you familiar with that at all? Because I had just heard about it recently, but I haven't had time to look into it. So,
I'm aware of the group. I haven't engaged with them or had any meaningful dialogue, but I understand they're doing good work. And certainly, one thing that needs to happen is to get young people engaged in sustainable farming. That initial back in the 50s, farmers got shoved off their land and farming got into the control of big business. We need to undo that again and train people how to get back to the land and how to be farmers. And I think there's a lot of movement on that front. I'm very hopeful there. I do see one question that I'd like to answer. Jenny, I know I told you to jump in, but there's a question from Carol, and I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. She asked, what type of arguments are most successful for Indiana legislators who are mostly from rural districts and not so your questions wouldn't be seen as anti-business? That is a really tough question, a good question. We know that the ag industry, because it is literally backed by multinational corporations, have lots of money, endless resources, and lobbyists that kind of control all levels of government. So I'm not saying that policy reform is easy, and that it isn't going to take some intense work and growing the movement on our part, which is kind of what this whole education and outreach is all about. But if we don't try, if we don't do something, if we sit at the sidelines, then the status quo continues. And so to your question, as far as the arguments that are most successful, I don't know that any one particular argument is going to work with every conservative lawmaker or rural lawmaker. But to the extent that lawmaker hears from the people that vote him or her in or out, that's what makes the difference. So when they start seeing that their constituents care and that the ability of that person to get reelected is at stake, that's when lawmakers will make a change. As far as specific issues that we seem to resonate with rural lawmakers would be, those related to economic impacts. So if you can point to statistics that promoting sustainable farming creates jobs, which it does, promotes local economic development, which it does, those sorts of economic arguments do better than environmental impacts or public health. The stories of people who are suffering from Kfos, unfortunately, don't seem to really carry the day. And as far as that type of information, the citizen guide that we've shared has a lot of great statistics on how Kfos depress local economies and how sustainable local farms actually revitalize local economic development in rural communities. So there's some good statistics in the citizen guide for you to use.
And apologies if we discussed this or if this was already answered. I've been focusing on reading these and missing some of the conversation. But Cheryl had mentioned basically, the cost of the higher locally produced meats and how fitting that into the your budget. Any more comments on that?
Can you say that again, Jenny? I'm not
sure. Basically, Cheryl had said that someone had mentioned Tyner Farms. She'd love to try some of the meat from them. The hurdle for most people, if their prices are similar to other producers, is the price. They're so much higher than the grocery stores. So how they've already moved away from meat, focusing on wild caught fish. So when they do want meat, the extra cost to buy from these producers buy from these local producers won't break the budget. So just kind of addressing the issue of the cost of the higher cost of the locally produced meats.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That of course is a real issue. Those of us who are more privileged are able to make these sorts of, healthy choices, whereas people, low-income folks who live in food deserts and don't have access, suffer. And that, again, is part of why we need a policy change. It should not be cheaper to buy a bacon double cheeseburger from Burger King than it is to buy what you need to make a healthy salad or, a healthy meal. And that's where those subsidies, federal subsidies, are so important. So until that changes, until we can get Congress to reallocate the money away from big ag and into supporting the local infrastructure and monies towards sustainable regenerative farming, these cost disparities are going to continue. So that really is the answer. For those of us who can take advantage of it, that's great. But for those who are not, that's going to remain the same until we change where our tax dollars go.
Can I just ask a question here in real time?
Yes. Yeah.
It seems like we've covered a lot, and there's a lot of facets of this issue. If we want to make like an effective change, it seems like we should focus on something that we might be able to accomplish. Mm-hmm. And considering that we live in a conservative state and a mostly rural state, we can't expect to, change everything very fast. Mm-hmm. I just wonder, what's the best way, what's the one issue that we might, if we all started supporting one issue, that we could change, that we had a possibility of actually changing, what would that be?
In my view, the most impactful thing that everyone can do is change consumer demand. We've seen over the last even decade, less than a decade, that food companies are starting to recognize consumer demand for organic products, free range, cage-free. I'm sure you've all seen this at the grocery store. Like, they're paying attention that people want something different. And so shifting your dollars, if you can, buying away from getting your meat and dairy at grocery stores, the more people that do that, and it is happening, becoming part of that movement just helps that happen even faster. I think that's the low-hanging fruit. But as far as advocacy, in Indiana, what has to happen for us to make any sort of state legislative change is for everybody to contact their state lawmakers. It's literally picking up the phone and saying, I want you to do something about Kfos. You don't have to have a fancy talking point. You don't have to know all the statistics. It's literally sending an email, writing a letter, picking up the phone, and telling your state lawmaker what you want him or her to do. It's easy. People get real afraid of it. But if more people did that, then we would be able to counter the voice of big ag. And I saw one of the questions was about, where does the Farm Bureau fit into this? Farm Bureau is a huge part. The pork producers, all these big lobbying groups that represent big ag, they are at the State House every day, and lawmakers are listening to what they have to say all the time. Yet we're over here, HEC and a few organizations speaking up, but the people who are actually impacted, folks who actually care, the constituents of these lawmakers, that's where we can make a difference. But it's literally everybody who cares about this has to speak up. It's not enough to just sit on the sidelines. That was a really great question. And it's not an easy one. Let me just add that there's no silver bullet. We have at HEC a multi-pronged strategy that we have been working on for more than a decade now. Part of it is education, reaching people one by one, just like we're doing today, spreading the word one by one. We litigate. We have, I brought cases against factory farms, litigating for policy change. We advocate at the State House and at the federal level. So, we're trying to tackle this on all fronts, but again, it's going to take more than an organization. It takes people power. It takes a movement. And so hopefully this information will prompt you to think about what it is you can do. You can't do it all. We understand that, but pick one or two things that you can do and that you'll stick with. And that makes a huge difference.
Just scrolling through here, Kim, and anyone who has a question right now, please feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand or type it in. But there was some discussion about organic certification of farms and how cost prohibitive that can be for the smaller farms. I didn't know if you wanted to make any comments on that.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is, and I see the comment, it might be what you're talking about. There's really no good certification of what it means to be free range, cage free, or organic. Is that what you're getting at, Jenny?
I think that's part of it, but yes, there was also just essentially how organic being a governmental designation that a lot of the local smaller producers can't afford to go through the red tape.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah. No, that's very true. Yeah. So let me tackle it this way. First of all, if you don't, the most important thing you can do, if you can do it, is to know the farmer that you're getting your food from, right? So the best and first is go to a CSA or a co-op where it's all supplied by local farmers. So the food that you buy is from a farmer that you know. If you can't do that, then the next best thing is to, at your grocery store, buy the organic, free range, cage free, but check them out. Check out those representations because they aren't very well regulated. Sometimes it's hard to do. We do have information on our website that kind of breaks down who's legit and who isn't. So know your farmer first. If you can't do that, try to at least understand where the product is that you're buying comes from. And I think, that's really all anyone can do. But in Madison County in particular, you guys have so many great resources that it shouldn't be that difficult. Just an easy search, I found more than 20 co-ops, local farms, farmers markets, and you can order a lot of this stuff online. Somebody mentioned, and I mentioned in my presentation, Tyner Pond Farms, Purple Porch. There are many that will deliver right to your front door. So it's really pretty easy to do.
Yes, and Market Wagon is another great one. Oh, there we go. Sharon just mentioned that. It's an excellent one that has, lots of local farms and local producers on there, and they do make it very easy. Katie, I had asked a question, so I'm going back to find it. Oh, okay. She says, every time I've ever written a legislator, all I get is a form letter back explaining why my perspective is wrong and theirs is right. Do you really hear any legislators changing their proposals and votes? I know this is kind of the perennial question.
I know. Yeah, I wish, I'm not here saying, that, again, there's no silver bullet and this isn't easy. And yes, that happens more times than not. But in answer to your question, I have seen lawmakers change their position when they hear from enough people. So don't get discouraged. It will no doubt happen to you that you'll send in your concerns and you may get a form letter back. But keep at it. Don't give up. Don't let that be the end of the conversation. And if you've got neighbors and, you can do education as well. Hey, I went to this forum today and I learned all this great stuff and I want you to know about this. We all can play a role. And this is a slow process. This is what social movements are all about. Not to get too philosophical, but if we think back to the civil rights era and, what had to happen over decades to get change, it didn't happen overnight. It took lots and lots of sacrifice and work to make incremental change. And that's really the same thing here. This is a social movement. It's about saving our planet. It's about saving this planet for future generations. It's about our health. It's about our environment. It's about, things that we care about. So it's worth fighting for. And we all have to do our part.
Absolutely. A couple oversights or overarching comments. And again, with the comments, somebody had mentioned getting involved locally with the city council and mentioned Jennifer Culp and Rebecca Crooms and Anderson. And those are, I would agree. I forget who said that, but they seem to be allies on being concerned about the environment. Pam had mentioned that. So definitely, attend the city council meetings. You never know. Kind of start from the grassroots and, get to know them if you don't already and keep an eye on local issues, and that's obviously just for Anderson, but for all of the communities as well. And a little bit of discussion as well about not having to actually remove meat altogether from your diet, but just considering eating smaller portions of it. Less meat is also an option, because it isn't a necessity for us. It's really, as Katie says, just a habit. So you can still cut back on it without cutting it out of your diet. Is just a small step, and those steps do make a difference. And then there's been some great discussion too about cage-free eggs, pasture-raised eggs, those kind of labels. And I'm sure everyone's read the discussions already, but I don't know if you have anything to add to that as far as those kind of misleading labels.
Yeah, they can be misleading, and it's really buyer beware, and do your homework. It's up to you to, if you care about this, to do your homework and find out where the products that you buy are coming from. These are great. This is such a great discussion. I really appreciate it. Keep the questions coming. We've got a little more time.
I think we've made it through most of the ones in chat. So again, please feel free to come off mute and ask any questions or type it in the chat box. Again, Sharon has spoken a little bit about just kind of, and being sure to ask farmers if they're, someone who cares about sustainability in their operations, they're going to be willing to answer those questions. And someone who has something to hide may act annoyed, and that's probably a very good point. I would agree with that. So yeah, it's you can reach out to any of the growers on the Market Wagon as well. So Spangler Farm. I'm not familiar with Spangler Farms. Maybe Alice
is that you?
I didn't want to put her on. I didn't want to put her on. Do you have
Is that
anything?
your farm, Alice?
I know she lives on a beautiful old farmstead.
Spangler Farms is actually in Yorktown, and my husband is related to that part of the Spangler group. And I've been thinking more about what my husband and I both do, is that we grow lots of vegetables, and that's what we eat all winter. Of course, we're also buying meat as well. But I think the other piece, and it may not be all that feasible for a lot of people who live in more of a urban area, but to encourage the homegrown farming I do a lot of food preservation, and the good thing I know about is I know what's in that food.
Yep. Excellent point. Very excellent point.
It's really a good experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been so encouraged with all of the urban farming that's been sprouting at rooftop gardens, all just real innovative ways, community gardens. There's so much happening on that front, which is very exciting. And it's all about diversifying the food system. I mean, that's truly where we have to end up, where it's not concentrated into big, corporate producers, but we're getting back to the, a local diverse system where some people are growing their own food, they're local farmers growing food that's sold, locally in the community, where people interact and know one another, and where your food is coming from. That's really what we have to get back to. That's great. Thank you, Alice, for sharing that.
I've just launched a poll, just as a side note, if anybody wants to answer some of those questions.
Right.
Barb had mentioned, how can we buy out the commercial farms as farmers leave the industry?
Oh, that's a good question. You might not remember, but one of the slides I talked about was the Federal Farm System Reform Act, which is that federal law I want us to all get behind. If that passes, there would be money to help people who want to transition out of factory farming. So they would do a buyout and help them transition their farm to a sustainable one. So that's a good reason to get behind that federal law. And again, all of the the information about how you would contact your congressional leaders are in my slides, as well as the citizen guide and also on HEC's website. So if you want to weigh in on that, that's a really good bill to get behind. We're hopefully going to be having a way that you can submit a letter through HEC's website to your congressional leaders on that bill. So stay tuned. We'll be sending out follow-up emails with information about how you can act on the various bills that I talked about in subsequent emails, which actually brings me to a point that Jenny wanted me to raise. When you get an email from us, we promise we will not abuse your email address. You're not going to get slews of emails from us. But when we do send you an email, it's with some critical information about how you can take action. And so please don't delete the emails, read them and take action. I mean, some of the questions I've received today is, well, what can I do with, there's all this stuff that you presented today, Kim, it just seems really overwhelming. What can one person do? And so many of our follow-up emails will be providing, some specific action alerts, things that you can do specifically. And we'll try to make it easy for you to do that.
Yes, and along those lines, we will be sending a survey out shortly, as well as a recording of this forum to your emails. It'll be hopefully by the end of the weekend, early next week at the latest. So please do keep an eye out for it. We really appreciate it. Please take just a couple of minutes to fill out that survey because, like I said earlier, we have a lot of forums coming up and we like to use the responses on those to really form the future ones. So your feedback really is valuable. And feel free also to share the recording when you get it, share it far and wide. And if you know people in other counties, or if you yourself would like to attend any in the future, you can always do that as well.
Yeah. Well, great. We're a little bit early. I'm happy to take more questions, but if we don't, I know it's a Saturday. There's no law against us ending early. But I do want to make sure that I've covered everyone's questions. So I'm going to wait just a few minutes before I say goodbye.
Doing a quick check here through the final chats. Okay, Barb, I think the question you're asking about was a Farm System Reform Act was the bill that Kim had mentioned. Okay. Okay. Actually, Katie's point, I've read that if you make changes, especially in the beginning, to a letter sponsored by an organization like HEC, legislators will pay more attention than if they are all read the same.
Yeah, very good point. I would say the hierarchy of impact when contacting a legislator is first a phone call. Well, actually, scratch that. Face-to-face. If you go down to the State House and meet face-to-face with a lawmaker, that's the best. Next is a phone call. Third would be a handwritten letter. Fourth would be an email. Fifth would be to sign an online petition, like what I mentioned. But anything is better than nothing. So anything that you can squeeze, any advocacy you can squeeze in, it's worth doing.
One final thing I'd like, could I say, sorry, just to squeeze this in, because I don't know that we mentioned it. If you're not already familiar with it already, Collective Roots is a cafe in Anderson that you should definitely check out as well. I know they're going to be involved with the farmers market in Anderson, and I'm sure many of you probably know more than that than I do already about Anna possibly running that or being the new director. And I know that the farmers market is switched from Park Place Community Center to a new location. So do look into that. And again, I know Sharon Fleck has the wealth of information on all of that. So, and then lastly, do be on the lookout too. We are going to be hopefully starting some kind of group and or volunteer program around sustainable food and farming movement in the state, kind of connecting all of these county groups together. So that will be in the hopefully near future within the next few months. So keep an eye out for something like that if you're looking to get more involved. That's all I have.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm being so nice, letting you go 15 minutes ahead of time. Enjoy your Saturday, everyone. Thank you for spending it with me. Please do follow up with me, Jenny, or Susie McGovern with any questions that you might have. I really do enjoy the conversation. I would love to hear from you. So thank you all again for spending your Saturday with us.